So a very warm welcome today to this webinar. We're here to talk about a topic that we at Ledgy get constantly asked about, namely international equity. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago, a CFO messaged me on LinkedIn asking me, well, I have a German entity, but and I'm giving ownership to my German employees, but also have 3 other entities in Europe, and I really want to expand my ownership to these 4 entities. How do I even get started about this? How do I design this in the best way? And I think that, you know, this story of this CFO is a very typical story that is happening a lot, especially in Europe, because we're facing a fragmented market. And so companies tend to go international very early on. And especially that has been also accelerated a lot by the pandemic, where remote working has become the norm. So hiring internationally is obviously great, but it also comes with challenges, especially when it comes to equity. And so today I'm really thrilled to have 2 experts with us today, Pedro from remote.com and Michael from Osborne Clarke. So without further ado, would love to quickly hand over to both of you for an intro of yourself and your companies and firms. So yeah, maybe Michael, go ahead.
Hi there, everyone. Thanks, Yoko. Michael Carter. I'm a partner at Osborne Clarke. I head up our exec comp incentives practice in the UK, but also help and pretty much lead our international OCI practice on incentives, which covers most mainland Europe, the US, and key Asian economies. And I've been dealing with equity incentives for probably way too long.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone, and thanks, Yoko. I'm Pedro. I'm General Manager for Contractors at Remote. I led finance at Remote over the last 3 years and recently took this new challenge. So very close to all equity challenges, not only internal, but external. Remote as a global employment platform, we are head first into these challenges. Not only from a contractor perspective, where we are in 150 plus countries, but also as an employer of record, where we're employing your employees on our own entities in 75 countries already. So happy to talk about this subject that comes up every other day or every day even.
Amazing. Thank you for the intros, and interesting to know it's 75 countries. That's definitely a lot. So looking forward to dig into your personal experiences with that. And so the first question I'd love to dive into with is really regarding your personal experiences, both at Osborne Clarke, Michael, and at remote.com, Pedro. And I'd love to, you know, start with that, learn a bit about what you have learned over the years, also dealing with your customers. Then in a second step, I'd love to go into really the nitty-gritty of international equity, and especially also the difference between giving equity when using EOR, employer of record, such as remote.com, versus setting up a legal entity. And at the end, would love to go into more operational setup. So how do you actually set up your team for success when it comes to international equity? And we'll also have time dedicated for Q&As. So please feel free to type them in as we go in the chat, and we'll gather them and we'll answer the questions at once at the end. So Pedro, first of all, to you, remote.com, as you said, is a fully remote organization, which is very impressive for the size of the org, and also very international. And I'm very interested to learn from you, first of all, how do you at remote.com specifically handle equity? Do you have, you know, tax optimized schemes in many countries, or do you have one main plan? Any insights into how you're handling that at remote.com?
We have the setup we started with, and it was a while back, 4 years or so ago, was with a global scheme. So based in the US. So these are folks that have more significant advantages from a tax perspective than in other geographies. but the complexity and that was required to go local in every single country was significant. And usually you need to set this up quite early on in your journey. It's not later on, let's look back and review what we've done. And the focus then was really our rapid growth. Like we went from 5 countries to 75 countries I was mentioning in less than 3 years. So just the sheer speed that we were growing. We focus much more on customer optimization. But it's a fair program where everyone has access to equity. So independently of the benefits of not of local tax incentives, everyone has access to equity, which I think is the most important characteristic of our program. Is we account for everyone to be part of remote and to have their part of the success that we all share.
That's fantastic. And I assume you also use your own software. Like you use remote.com for employing, in fact, everyone in your company.
Yes, yes, we do use everyone, and it's obviously included as part of benefits that we include in the package.
And just a quick follow-up question here, because you mentioned you're extremely international yourself, but also a lot of your customers are international. And I'm curious here, did you observe over the past year some general trends when giving equity internationally? Is that something you get asked a lot at remote.com? Any kind of trends that you've been observing over the past years?
We get asked a lot that because I think it's increasingly becoming the norm with global companies, as you mentioned earlier on, global companies by default. So before, I think companies, it would be one of their internationalization challenges. Okay, now we need to think about equity. Now by default, you are set up as a global company. So the challenges usually come much earlier on than they used to come. As an employer of record, what we see is increasingly more complex companies, listed companies, even with RSUs and alternative to the standard stock plans, trying to understand how they can optimize as well and how they can leverage our model and our withholding capabilities and responsibilities and our internal capabilities from a tax perspective as well, to also continue offering equitable programs to the whole organization as they expand globally.
Absolutely, and we'll come back actually to that tax perspective later on as well, and learn a bit more about how remote.com supports with that. But in the meantime, I'd love to quickly switch over to you, Michael. First of all, curious, what is your experience listening to what Pedro just said around how global and international companies go about setting up their equity plans? Is that also your experience that typically global companies or very international companies have one global plan based in the US, or maybe more from a European perspective? What is the general trends that you see in the market?
Yeah, I think most companies will have a parent plan, but that will be usually very much based in their home parent company market. So if it's a UK company, it'll be a UK parent plan with subplans for the various jurisdictions in which they're operating in, and German or Dutch or whatever the case may be. So I think in most cases, because the company law is driven off the parent company, it'll very usually be a parent plan from where the parent is located.
Very clear. And then from then on, essentially expands to different entities or tax optimized plans depending on the markets they're opening.
Exactly, and what the nature of the employee is, as whether it's they're employed through employer of record, so actually they're strictly consultants for the parent company, or whether they're employed through either the parent company or local or holding company subsidiaries in the different jurisdictions, in which case you can look to localize and take advantage of local tax advantages if there are any.
And Michael, you mentioned in your introduction before, but also in our prep session yesterday, that you have different cases of customers coming to you. Some are UK companies, maybe expanding to mainland Europe, or vice versa, and also companies expanding to the US and vice versa. And over your many years of experiences dealing with these types of scenarios, I'm really curious, what would be one of the trickiest cases or one of the worst stories, a really big mess up you've experienced in your career about a company granting equity internationally, and how did you solve it?
I think the key, and I think Pedro mentioned this right at the beginning in terms of talking about remote zone journey, is actually planning at the beginning, and thinking of what you're wanting to do and what the issues may be in the different jurisdictions. I think the worst you can do is just assume everything is, and very often we see this, come and say, wait, it's too difficult or too costly to look at these issues in different jurisdictions, so we'll just grant them anyway. And of course, it's then picking up the issues after the event. So it may be that you've granted options to the US, to employees in the US. You may have you think US should be easy because it's similar language to the UK, but we say you've got a UK plan, your grants to the US. What kind of horrible issues can you come across? Well, there's a whole heap of them. They've got a special valuation. Valuations used in the UK aren't the same as in the US. So you may have some penal 20% tax on top of standard tax. You may have had employees that have exercised and left. There should have been withholding. The IRS aren't generally a nice fluffy organization, and they will hold a grudge. And you may well have to register or notify in local states, because again, although the US is one country, the states are very strong in terms of a number of their both tax and securities laws. So just giving the US as an example, there's a whole heap of different things just by that assumption that we'll just leave it. It's the employees or the consultants issue. We can just tell them, you have to do everything. Usually this comes home to bite on a transaction. So this, essentially people like me, lawyers and accountants, do the tax authorities' jobs for them in terms of doing a due diligence exercise. You look at it all as you're advising the buyer. You don't want to take on any risk. You can see there's a whole host of issues. That's the very worst time to discover it, because there's then nothing you can do about it, because I'm advising the buyer. I'm not advising either the employees or the company. At that point, there probably is tax, there probably are issues, there may be withholdings, there may be chips from the price, probably. So it's actually doing it far earlier, as Pedro said, planning for it, whichever route you go down, at least thinking about how you want to roll out options or incentives globally.
Yes, and so planning is key. At the same time, what also happens a lot in reality is that startups start in one market and then start, like the beauty, I would say, of solutions such as remote.com is that it really allows to move fast, right? You can really hire internationally super quickly without planning, and so this is actually a good segue to the next topic of how to actually go about it, and then also that this will lead us into what is the right time into actually planning. When do you actually do that? And so I'd love to transition to international equity and explore a bit how to go about it if you go via an EOR versus a legal entity. And so, Pedro, I would love to take an example. For example, if I am a company based in the UK and I'm looking to start hiring in Portugal, for example, and I'm assuming many tax and compliance issues will depend on whether I will have a legal entity there or whether I use an EOR solution like remote. So could you walk us through what are the main differences from a compliance and tax perspective if I go via EOR versus a legal entity to grant equity?
And until now, Portugal hasn't had any tax benefits or significant tax benefits for incentives, equity incentives. Usually it's relatively limited to non-existence. Now there is a new initiative to launch across Europe, but Portugal specifically are doing an initiative to launch equity programs for startups and benefits to those. So by establishing your own entity here, you more likely can access those, which are usually dependent of you having fiscal residency in the country as a company, but with that comes the burden of you opening your own entity, all the exposure that comes with it, and the burden from an administration perspective that comes with it, that we are all very aware of, that have played internationally. We know the burden, and all the withholding and communication obligations are with you, and I think that is the critical. If you leverage an employer of record, sometimes or most of the cases, access to those programs, even if you could have had access, which is very nuanced, especially with the current design, you likely won't have, because as Michael mentioned, is an external consultant type of equity allocation. But you have the advantage of very limited administration burden, like with us, with remote, or with whatever employer of record, or ideally they would do that. You have all the withholding obligations that an employee has to do on any incentives they receive, any communication with Social Security or IRS, local IRS, the same. Valuations, obviously we have experts in understanding what is the type of valuation in each country. So if it's a 409A type of valuation like you do in US, do you use the equivalent in UK because it's more conservative and your board has already approved it, and you do the same in Portugal, then we can advise and help the companies understanding what are the best options. So sometimes when we're moving very fast internationally, having this support with folks like Michael or some folks in our teams that have lived this and know exactly what is the experience to do it locally, it's faster and simpler, and prevents you from headaches down the line.
Fantastic. So yeah, it sounds like basically remote.com is really helpful when to move fast, to really hire internationally quickly, and also to reduce all the administrative burden, including withholding taxes, for instance, on equity, which is actually not obvious. I don't think every EOR offers this, so that's really great. And then what was mentioned a bit before is often what happens with companies is they tend to first hire, for example, with a remote.com, and then if there is a decision on a company level to in fact really scale a certain hub and really hire more people, typically then the administrative burden tends to be more, let's say, manageable or more justifiable. And so then there is the second way. So one is EOR. The second way is to really open a legal entity, which allows to, in fact, offer tax optimized scheme locally, which is the question I would have to you, Michael. So if let's say I am now a French company, for example, and I just opened a legal entity in the UK where I plan to really, scale my team. And let's say I want to grant stock options. Could you walk us through the process? How do I even get started? What do I need to pay attention to when it comes to taxes, etc.?
Of course. And one of those decisions when starting an entity in another jurisdiction to employ local people through is actually whether you just employ them through the parent company or whether you have an additional local entity, and that's a discussion for another day. But there is actually a knock-on for that in quite a number of European institutions, Germany being an obvious one, that it's very beneficial for the employees not to be employed by the same entity that is granting the stock options. So if you have it doesn't have to be a German subsidiary, it could be a French subsidiary or an English subsidiary, but as long as it's a different company than the parent, then it means you the rules, the employment, the labor law rules in Germany, which are quite significant, do not apply, and you don't have to review in relation to the grant of the stock options. So it means you can look at the stock, let's say you've got a UK or a US plan, which may not be as employee friendly in terms of good leaver, bad leaver provisions or termination. It means you can be fair and consistent across jurisdictions, so you don't have to tailor it to the German labor law because the employees are employed through a separate entity. So that's just one just to think about. And again, that's the question about planning before you grant, just to think about what are the issues, because it's not just tax. Actually, labor law and employment law are quite significant in terms of thinking how you might structure it. Most of my clients, not all, I've got a number of large listed companies, but most are tech clients, kind of the ones we've been talking about today, fast growing, who start off using remote and similar, will have a number of employees in a number of different jurisdictions that they employ through an employer of record, but over time will move into employing them directly. In your example, so the French company will have a stock option plan. Then you're wanting to grant options to the UK employees. First question is, what's available? What are the issues, the stumbling blocks? And can you take advantage of any tax advantaged arrangement in the UK? There are two for discretionary option plans, EMI, which probably everybody's familiar with, CSOP, which hasn't been available really until 6th of April, but the rules have changed. That's made that much more likely to be useful to companies coming into the UK. So is there a tax advantage plan? If there is, how easy is it to implement it? If we were going the other way, and it's a UK company going to France, then the ease is not quite as simple as it is coming the other way. As Pedro said, there's a number of European jurisdictions now that are trying to make themselves more attractive in this tech startup space. So Sweden, for example, introduced 2 years ago, might be 3 years ago, it's COVID slippage, a very similar plan, tax advantage plan to EMI in Sweden. Spain has some tax advantage arrangements. Germany at the moment is just putting in place similar arrangements. So it's becoming much more common now across mainland Europe to where there are tax advantage arrangements. In the UK, we've had them for a long time, and EMI is a particularly beneficial one. So that's why a lot of companies coming into the UK do use it if they can. And the other one is because actually it's not that difficult to put it in place. In most cases, it will not change the key terms of the plan. So the vesting provisions, the leaver provisions, your liquidity event, all of those will typically stay the same. And that's what companies usually want, is to try and keep it as similar as possible across jurisdictions. That's one of the key drivers, obviously, and Pedro mentioned that as well for remotes themselves. So it's how easy is it? Does it make sense given the numbers? It might do, because it's a senior individual that's just coming into the UK, even though there's only 3 employees. It's having that discussion about what the tax advantages are, what it you'll still need to do something anyway in the UK to make sure you're covering off the tax provisions, and that will be the same in any jurisdiction. And then it might just be adopting a sub-plan, amending the stock option agreements, which can be uploaded on Ledgy or whatever it might be, and can still be granted through those portals or via DocuSign or whatever. So actually, typically the process in most jurisdictions isn't that different. It's just planning and going through them up front, and then making sure that you're on top of the compliance provisions. Again, it's not that onerous, but you need someone to have pointed out what those are and registered and notified and doing annual returns or whatever the case may be in the different jurisdictions.
Fantastic. I have actually two quick follow-up questions. I think one is around the fact that we talked about going with an EOR versus actually taking the step to set up a legal entity. What would you say in your case, Michael, as to when you advise companies to choose one versus the other, depending on the country they want to start hiring in?
It's probably, you expect me to say this, I'm a lawyer. It's not a one size fits all, because sometimes those decisions might be driven by actually not employees, but about corporate tax, about actually what you're doing in that jurisdiction. Or you may be operating in a particular regulated market where that regulated market in that country makes things a lot easier if you have an entity in that market. Whereas others, you might get to 10 or 15 employees through EOR and you're still comfortable for a number of years. So it really is, as you say in the UK, horses for courses.
Clear, yeah.
But it's thinking about, and at least asking yourself the question as you're moving into that jurisdiction, what is right for us, what is our business plan, what is our process, who are our clients, what are the issues we're going to have to face in those jurisdictions, and should we move straight to an employment direct because it has advantages, or should use Pedro and remote because it makes our lives so much easier in those 2 years when we're setting up in 15 different countries and there's no way we've got the people in-house centrally in wherever to be able to manage that process. So it's very much having that discussion. Again, it's planning. Absolutely,
yeah. I think it also ties to what Pedro, what you were mentioning before around. It sounded like, for example, in Portugal, it's actually quite good to actually simply go via remote.com versus maybe in the UK, there's actually a very clear setup on how to actually set up a tax optimized scheme via an entity. So probably that is also to your point, Michael, it actually depends also on the country you're envisioning to scale your team in. And another quick follow-up I had as well is you actually both mentioned fairness. So, and I think that's a really interesting point, probably also for our audience, because when you look at different countries, you also face different taxations or termination rules. And Michael, you mentioned, that most companies want to make the rules fair or the same across all countries, such as vesting and so on. But how do you typically advise companies around how to make their plan fair across countries?
Well, it's asking them if they do to start with, because actually that might not be a driver. So for example, it might be a UK plan to start with, which are, because of the tax treatment here, we are historically, it's probably catching up slightly, are quite brutal in terms of a lot of stock option vesting and leaving. It's probably a majority are tech fast. It's leave, you lose. You have to be here at an exit. That is it. Whereas, for example, the standard US model, which has been West Coast for decades, is 1 year cliff, 4 year vesting, and you've got to leave for cause to lose your vested options. Now you can see those two models are inherently very, very different. It's a lot easier potentially incorporating and pushing in a US one, which you've started in the US and rolling that out internationally, as opposed to UK one, which you may have started as a leave you lose. If you're then rolling out to the US and you're operating in a very competitive marketplace, then that model might not resonate with the people you're trying to hire. So the fairness might not be your driver in that regard. So it does depend on where you're coming from, what provisions you have to start with, and again, it's having those discussions early doors.
Very clear. Now I'd love to switch over to our last topic area we wanted to cover, which is how do you set up your team internally for success? And to give a bit of context, at Ledgy, in our own experience, so we have currently 3 legal entities, and we've also used EORs such as remote.com. And then at some point we transitioned in those markets, so Germany, Switzerland, and the UK, to legal entities. And one learning, which we also talked about in this webinar so far, is that every country has different requirements. So just as one example, in the UK, for example, EMI valuations, which you need to grant stock options, expire after 90 days. And so just as an example, within our software, we're helping with warnings in the software that allow you to, for example, know, okay, my EMI valuation is expired, so I cannot grant anymore. But that being said, there is still very market-specific differences where the team is really needed. And so as you scale as well, you run through different challenges and so on. So my first question would be to you, Pedro. Remote.com is a very large organization, over 2,000 employees, I think. And so from your very own experiences scaling so quickly over the last 3 years, how does your team look like? How did you think about setting up the team for success?
The team was set up from a fully distributed mindset from the onset. So we early on, I was the first finance hire of Remote in April 2020. But we very quickly scaled to bring a lot of expertise in certain areas that we needed, independently of where people were in the world. And it was less driven by the internal size of the team, but much more by the aspirations and the speed that we were tackling the market. The first person I've hired was a director of treasury, which is never the first hire that anyone does in finance. So because our need was really into it, like quick banking expansion, relationships, moving large sums of capital across the world. So we set up with that initial mindset of what we need to have the highest impact possible in the organization. For other organizations, it's very different. For us, was that. We have built the traditional FP&A organization, the controllership organization, but also treasury, which is very significant for us. And another organization that is very strong at Remote, which is the tax organization in the finance team of Remote. Not only from transfer pricing, as you can imagine, like global movement, etc., but very specifically on personal income tax. So we have a team dedicated to that. And again, it was driven by the impact that we wanted to have in the world and with our customers. So if we were really into hand-holding them and helping them into expanding globally, into having fair and equitable programs that they know are reliable and they don't, in 3 years' time, we didn't withhold any taxes for the last 3 years for these employees. what happens now? Like we couldn't do that. So we really invested early on into putting these teams in place to the areas that we wanted to have the highest impact, and equity was one of them. As I mentioned, we do variants of equity and other type of fungible benefits. So including tokens, etc. So it's quite complex, and we invested early on. So differently from most of the companies, we were not driven by the number of the finance organization was not driven by the number of employees internally, which is usually like an administrative function, but much more to the product and the impact that we wanted to bring to the market, and how quickly we wanted to get there, and how much the finance team had to support there, because it was central to a lot of the things that we were doing.
And so it sounds that you also had a different approach, because part of your offering is really related to helping companies with, you know, taxes and international equity offerings. One additional question I have is really internally as a company, as remote.com, how are you set up? Being so international, do you have you know, one team specifically when it comes to equity and all the, you know, reporting and taxes that come with it? Do you have one team that is responsible for everything globally, or is it you know, more local? How do you go about that?
In a traditional company, I would have a single team. At remote it's slightly different, because we are a customer of our own product, including the people that serve us. So we have country specialists, like we have dozens of thousands of employees for customers. So we have country specialists, but I think the more specialized it goes, the more central it is, despite being everyone fully distributed. So the personal income tax team is relatively small in size, but then it connects with all the local teams when it goes into like what we need to withhold, or what is the information that we need to obtain from X, Y, or Z, or with customer success we need to discuss valuation with a company or whatever it may be, and so the more specialized functions tend to be more centralized, and the other more product enablers tend to be much more market specific, also given our size, which is quite significant.
Absolutely. And Michael, very curious, what is your experience also, you know, interacting with other customers of similar sizes, such as remote.com? Is it also the setup you see, or what would be your advice around how to best set up the team internally?
As Pedro says, I think he's a unique organization, but also a particularly large one in terms of, you know, probably, I don't know about the, can't see who all the participants are, but probably for the clients on the and participants on the call today, where we're talking about slightly smaller numbers, where typically their central function will be a lot smaller, sometimes one person, and they will therefore lean on their advisors significantly. Now that might be ourselves, it might be Pedro, it might be Ledgy, or it might be a combination of all of those, to help them through the process, because they just don't have the resources to be able to manage it if they're operating in more than just a couple, because it does, as you said, in terms of EMI valuations, as an example, year ends in different jurisdictions, all of those types of things. I think in a lot of them, companies can manage it, and what they'll do is when they then, you know, if they're granting stock options every 6 months, then, you know, that's when they'll reach out again and, what do we need to do? I know we did it last time, but can you take us through it again? Or has anything changed? We're comfortable if it's all the same. You know, it depends jurisdiction by jurisdiction and the experience of the individuals internally.
Absolutely. And I see we are almost at time, so I would love to now switch over to a few questions. And I'm sure that, you know, we're also here after this session for any questions the audience has Probably we're all reachable via LinkedIn, I assume. So feel free to also ask questions after the session. But I think I see here two questions that we can answer in the few minutes we have left. So one is, well, the reality that we've been facing in the past month in tech, unfortunately, is that there were a number of layoffs, right? And in that context, which is the current one, when it comes to equity, what and the question I think would be to you, Michael, perhaps, what are some of the pitfalls or some of the aspects that companies need to be mindful of when termination comes for an employee and their grants?
Yeah, and I think you're going to be governed by two things. One is what the plan rules say themselves, and then what applies potentially over and above that or cuts right across it in the local jurisdiction in which the employees are employed. I mentioned Germany before. Depending on how they were employed, then they may have to be treated completely differently than what the rules say. Now, hopefully, again, you've thought about this right at the beginning, so you know what the rules are in terms of all of the jurisdictions if there's issues in terms of terminations, i.e., can you just rely on what the rules of the plan say and the stock agreement, or can you not, because you're going to be taken to court to a labor tribunal in Germany, and you won't and you lose because of the way that they're employed. And Germany is just an example. In France, a lot of mainland European, or California, in the United States, assumption that you can just terminate people in the US, well, broadly, unless they live in California. So it's that kind of homework you've done in advance, so you know. So the worst thing the major mistake is terminating before you've checked what the position is, because then there's no way back if you've done something that cuts across local labor laws, and that can be expensive.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So yeah, I think it comes back again to just informing oneself and planning ahead. And a last question for Pedro. From the audience, someone asked, I understand that ESOP is possible via EOR. What about virtual stock options, so virtual shares? If that is also possible, what are the differences to consider?
It's possible. It's an agreement between two parties, so there is no, and it's more of a monetary compensation more than anything else. So VSOPs is exactly like countries like Germany, where it's super complicated, avoiding you having to go to the notary every time you need to issue new stock. So it's certainly possible. I have particular views on that because it limits the upside for the employee. So I think it's not it's simple, but it's not the most attractive package, I would say, from a benefits perspective, and an equitable offering especially because it's a more competitive market. People will not accept virtual stock options, but it's certainly possible. It's a matter of drafting the required agreements, and at termination, which usually is when they are executable, all parties go through the contract, and as Michael was saying, they know what their dues are, and they respect those.
Well, before we end this session, which we will have to do in a few minutes, I'm very curious to both of you, Michael and Pedro, what is, as we conclude, what is your single best piece of advice for the audience today when it comes to giving equity internationally?
I think it's just plan before acting.
Love it.
Yeah. Mine is build an equitable program as much as you can. Giving opportunities outside of markets that are very used to having access to these can change lives, and it's an opportunity for us to go much broader with these opportunities, and that would be mine.
Love that. Thank you so much. Couldn't have ended with better words, planning and make it fair. It counts. Your team is global, so make sure it's also felt globally. Thank you so much again, Michael and Pedro, for this amazing session. Thank you for the to the audience for tuning in today. As said, we're available after this as well via LinkedIn, for example, if there are any more questions. This session will be recorded, so feel free to check it out as well on ledgy.com. And I wish you a very great day and see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.